Hey everyone, I'm your host, Malick Mercier, and this is GBH's Why It Matters, the history series where we use the past to explain the present. It seems like lately the news is full of stories about clashes over our right to express ourselves.
So we're here, and we're going to make that point, and we're not leaving.
There's everything from book banning, to Twitter suspensions, to controversies over campus speakers. But what does freedom of speech really mean? And how has it evolved since the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution in 1791? Here to talk about the history of free speech and to help us connect the past to the present is Professor Chris Capozzola. Dr. Capozzola, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Why did the framers of the Constitution believe that freedom of speech was such an essential right that they listed it in the First Amendment? Why was it so important?
There's a historical reason, right, that almost everything in the Bill of Rights is something that the founders thought that the British had taken away from them or prevented them from having. Then there's also a real sort of structural thing that they wanted to do. They thought, well, if we're going to have a democracy, if we're going to engage in this democratic experiment, we're going to need ideas. And we're going to need to make sure that the best ideas get out there so that we can hear them, so that we can make the best decisions if we're going to trust people to govern themselves.
What is the purpose of free speech?
Free speech is something we need in order to run a democracy, right? You can't have voting, you can't have debate, you can't have deliberation if people can't speak and say what they want.
Who or what has helped to define the freedom of speech, what it actually does and doesn't mean for all of us?
The First Amendment is really clear. It says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And you would think that that would settle it, but it turns out it's more complicated than that. Some forms of speech have been restricted by government institutions. The Supreme Court has generally been the institution that makes up its mind about what's protected and what's not. So, for example, things that are directly harmful, like threats, speech like that is generally not protected as free speech. This is a really crucial turning point in American history. Before the First World War, and even during the war, a lot of people just didn't have the rights of free speech that the Constitution said that they did, despite the First Amendment being on the books. In World War I, it gets really tough. This is an unpopular war, and President Wilson imposes a series of restrictions that say you can't speak out against the war, you can't criticize the war effort, you can't criticize military draft, and in response, there is significant repression. Newspapers are shut down for anti-war speakers. Out of this crisis of the First Amendment come new movements for civil liberties, and even the phrase civil liberties is a product of the First World War. Organizations of pacifists, of women suffragists, of ethnic minorities, all of these groups are coming together in new ways to kind of advocate for free speech. In the 1920s, they lose more battles than they win, but they set up some of the real sort of new ideas and priorities for the 20th century.
There have been a lot of free speech cases that are centered around students. What's the role that students have played in defining free speech in the U.S.?
We can see this in a couple of really important cases that ended up before the Supreme Court. One had to do with during the Vietnam War, a case called Tinker versus Des Moines, where a group of students who were opposed to the Vietnam War wanted to wear black armbands to school to protest the U.S. involvement in that war. They were, sort of punished by their schools, and they felt that this violated their rights as political speakers, and they brought their case all the way up to the Supreme Court and won. And that was an important expansion of the rights of students to have political ideas in school and to have the right to share them.
The Tinker versus Des Moines decision was made in the 1960s. Can we talk about today and where we stand now? What's covered by free speech and what's not?
The Supreme Court has expanded over the years what's covered by free speech, and that includes not just writing an editorial, but also new media formats, new forms of public protest and engagement, what the court calls expressive conduct. At the same time, the Supreme Court has been very clear that what's covered includes unpopular ideas, not just the ideas that you have, but the ideas that you might not like. This is what Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes called freedom for the thought that we hate. And that has included, even in the 1970s, the Supreme Court supported the rights of Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois, a historically Jewish community outside Chicago. And this was a very controversial case, a difficult case for the Supreme Court to decide. And I think it resonates with our discussions today about how we balance really difficult and controversial ideas with our understanding that if we don't hear these ideas, our democracy might suffer.
And so how do you see controversies over free speech playing out today?
The task of balancing free speech with building community is something that the next generation of students has to take on and define for themselves, just as the students did when they were protesting the Vietnam War. But one thing that I always like to bear in mind, the cure for speech that you don't like is more speech. And so it's important when there are sort of controversies about speech to make room for other ideas. And even if those conversations are difficult, if you're hearing ideas you don't like, it's important to kind of speak up against them and to make sure that everyone who has those views is getting heard.
Chris, thank you so much for being here today and for helping us understand that although freedom of speech is a constitutional right, it isn't an unlimited right, and it is constantly being challenged. People have fought to protect it for 250 years, and we can see how that fight continues today.